One cold, foggy night, I was waiting for the last bus to take me home after a late shift at work. The bus stop was located at the edge of a dense forest, which only added to the eerie atmosphere. The fog was so thick that I could barely see a few feet ahead. The dim streetlight above me flickered intermittently, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. I checked my watch and saw that it was almost midnight. The bus was running late, and the silence was becoming unsettling. I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Just as I was beginning to think about calling a cab, I heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. The bus's headlights pierced through the fog, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The bus pulled up to the stop, and the doors opened with a hiss. I stepped inside, immediately noticing how empty it was. Only a few passengers were scattered throughout the bus, each one sitting quietly, their faces obscured by shadows. The driver, an older man with a weary expression, gave me a nod as I paid my fare and took a seat near the middle. As the bus started moving, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The interior of the bus felt colder than it should have been, and the passengers were eerily silent. The fog outside seemed to grow thicker, and I found it hard to make out any landmarks. It was as if we were driving through an endless, gray void. I glanced at the other passengers, trying to find some reassurance, but they all seemed lost in their own worlds, staring blankly ahead. I tried to strike up a conversation with the woman sitting across from me, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, and her skin was pale as if she hadn't seen sunlight in years. Feeling a growing sense of unease, I decided to move closer to the front of the bus. As I stood up, the lights flickered and I stumbled slightly. When the lights came back on, I noticed that more passengers had appeared, but I hadn't seen anyone get on. They were all sitting in the same rigid, unnatural manner, their faces still hidden in shadow. I made my way to the driver and asked him how much longer until we reached my stop. He didn't turn to look at me, just stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. "Not much longer," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. I returned to my seat, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. The bus continued to trudge through the fog, and I noticed that the route seemed unfamiliar. The fog outside was so dense now that it felt like we were moving through a dream. I couldn't see any street signs or buildings, just an endless sea of gray. Suddenly, the bus came to an abrupt halt. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, I realized that the bus was completely empty. All the passengers, including the driver, had vanished. My heart raced as I stood up and looked around. The silence was deafening, and the cold air seemed to press in on me from all sides. I walked down the aisle, calling out, but there was no response. Panic set in as I reached the front of the bus and saw that the driver's seat was empty. The bus doors were open, and outside was nothing but dense fog. I stepped off the bus, hoping to find some sign of life, but the fog swallowed everything around me. I wandered aimlessly, feeling disoriented and scared. The fog seemed to grow thicker with each step, and I could barely see my own hand in front of my face. Just when I thought all hope was lost, I saw a faint light in the distance. Desperate, I stumbled towards it. As I got closer, I realized it was the same bus stop where I had originally boarded. The bus was nowhere to be seen, and the streetlight was still flickering above. I collapsed onto the bench, my mind racing to make sense of what had happened. The sound of the approaching bus snapped me back to reality. This time, when the bus arrived, it looked normal, and the driver was a young woman who greeted me with a warm smile. I hesitated for a moment before stepping on. The passengers seemed normal, chatting quietly among themselves. I took a seat and glanced around, half expecting the eerie silence and pale faces to return, but everything seemed normal. I reached my stop without any further incidents, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I never found out what happened or where that other bus had taken me. The fog, the disappearing passengers, and the empty bus still haunt my dreams. A chilling reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved. It was late at night, and I was stranded at a bus stop in the middle of nowhere. I had missed my usual bus, and the next one wasn't due for another hour. The area was deserted, and the only light came from a flickering street lamp above the bus stop. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. As I waited, I noticed a figure approaching from down the road. The figure moved slowly, almost shuffling, and as it got closer, I could make out a man dressed in tattered clothes. His face was obscured by a hood, and his movements were jerky, as if he were struggling to walk. An uneasy feeling settled over me, but I tried to shake it off. After all, it was just another person waiting for the bus, right? The man finally reached the bus stop and took a seat on the bench next to me. He didn't say a word, just sat there with his head down, breathing heavily. I could feel his presence, cold and unsettling, and I couldn't bring myself to look directly at him. The air around us seemed to grow colder, and I wrapped my coat tighter around me. Minutes passed in uncomfortable silence. I glanced at my watch, willing the time to move faster. Suddenly the man spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It's not safe here," he said. I turned to look at him, but his face was still hidden in shadow. "You should leave before it arrives." Confused and alarmed, I asked, "What do you mean? What's going to arrive?" He didn't answer, just kept his head down and continued to breathe heavily. The sense of dread grew stronger, and I felt a chill run down my spine. A few moments later, I heard a distant sound, like the low growl of an engine. The man next to me tensed up and muttered, "It's coming." I looked down the road and saw headlights approaching, but something about them seemed off. The lights were too high, too bright, and they cast long, twisted shadows. The growling engine grew louder, and I realized it wasn't the sound of a regular bus. It was deeper, more menacing, like the roar of a beast. The headlights drew closer, and I could see the outline of a large dark shape. It didn't look like any vehicle I'd ever seen. The air around us grew colder still, and the man next to me stood up abruptly. "You have to run," he said urgently. "Don't let it take you." He started to walk away, his movements still jerky and unnatural. I watched him go, frozen in place by fear and confusion. The growling engine was almost upon me now, and I could feel the ground vibrating beneath my feet. The monstrous vehicle finally came into view. It was a grotesque amalgamation of metal and shadows, its surface shifting and writhing like a living thing. The headlights were like eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The doors swung open with a loud creak, revealing a dark, empty interior. I felt an overwhelming compulsion to step inside, but the man's words echoed in my mind. Gathering all my strength, I turned and ran in the opposite direction. As I fled, I could hear the monstrous vehicle revving its engine, but it didn't give chase. I glanced back once and saw it sitting there, its headlights still glaring, before it slowly faded into the darkness. I didn't stop running until I reached a more populated area. Breathless and terrified, I looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The memory of that night still haunts me, and I never wait at that bus stop anymore. I often wonder about the man who warned me, and what might have happened if I hadn't listened. The image of that monstrous vehicle and its glowing eyes remains etched in my mind, a reminder of the dangers that lurk in the shadows. It was a rainy evening, and I was waiting at the bus stop after a long day at work. The city was unusually quiet, with the only sound being the pitter-patter of raindrops on the pavement. I was drenched and shivering, hoping the bus would arrive soon. The streetlight above the bus stop flickered sporadically, casting an eerie glow on the wet sidewalk. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a bus approaching in the distance. Its headlights pierced through the fog and rain. As it got closer, I noticed that it looked old and battered, like it hadn't been in service for years. The bus came to a screeching halt in front of me, and the door creaked open. I hesitated for a moment, feeling a strange sense of unease, but I was desperate to get out of the rain. I stepped onto the bus and found it almost empty, save for a few passengers scattered throughout. They all looked odd, dressed in outdated clothes and staring blankly ahead. The driver, an old man with hollow eyes, gave me a nod as I paid my fare and took a seat near the middle. As the bus started moving, I noticed something peculiar. The passengers didn't seem to be moving at all. They were completely still, almost as if they were frozen in time. The bus moved at a steady pace, but the outside scenery seemed to be changing rapidly, faster than it should. The fog grew denser, and the rain turned into a heavy downpour. I tried to make conversation with the person sitting next to me, but they remained unresponsive, staring straight ahead. I felt a growing sense of dread. The atmosphere was thick with an unspoken tension. The bus took a sharp turn, and the lights flickered off for a moment. When they came back on, I noticed that some of the passengers had disappeared, replaced by dark, shadowy figures. Panic set in. I stood up and made my way to the driver, intending to ask him to stop the bus and let me off. As I approached him, he turned to look at me, and I saw that his eyes were completely black. "You shouldn't have gotten on this bus," he said in a voice that echoed unnaturally. "This bus is not for the living." I stumbled back, horrified. The passengers who remained started to turn towards me, their faces melting away to reveal empty black voids. I could feel the bus picking up speed, the scenery outside blurring into a dark, swirling mass. I desperately pulled the cord to signal the stop, but the bus didn't slow down. I ran to the back door and pounded on it, screaming for help, but no one outside seemed to hear me. The shadows inside the bus began to close in on me, their whispers growing louder, filling my head with a cacophony of sinister voices. I could feel their cold presence wrapping around me, suffocating me. Just when I thought it was the end, the bus came to a sudden halt. The doors creaked open, and I was thrown out onto the wet pavement. I scrambled to my feet and looked around, finding myself back at the same bus stop where I had boarded. The bus was gone, and the street was as empty and quiet as before. I ran home, my mind racing with fear and confusion. To this day, I never take the bus at night. The memory of those hollow-eyed passengers and the driver's ominous words still haunt me. I can still hear the echo of the shadows' whispers, reminding me of that nightmarish ride on the Phantom bus. One night, my friend and I were heading out of the city. It was around 2 a.m., and the streets were eerily quiet. We decided to stop at the first bus stop we saw to take a break. The bus stop was completely deserted, with only an old broken-down bench and a flickering streetlight. We sat down and started chatting to pass the time. Suddenly, out of nowhere, an old woman appeared. She had strange, hollow eyes that seemed to be filled with darkness. She stood there silently, staring at us without blinking. My friend whispered, "Let's get out of here." But before we could move, the old woman spoke in a low, raspy voice. "The last bus, it never comes." A chill ran down my spine as I looked around and realized how isolated we were. My friend and I decided to leave immediately. As we got up, the old woman reached out and grabbed my arm with an icy grip. Her touch was so cold it felt like it was burning my skin. She leaned in close and whispered, "Beware the shadows." We pulled away and started running. As we looked back, we saw the old woman still standing there. But now there were shadowy figures emerging from the darkness behind her. They had no faces, just black voids where their features should have been. They started moving towards us, their footsteps echoing eerily in the empty street. We ran faster, our hearts pounding in our chests. When we finally reached a more populated area, we stopped and looked back one last time. The bus stop was empty again, as if nothing had happened, but I could still feel the icy grip of the old woman on my arm and hear her haunting whisper, "Beware the shadows,